Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're decoding a series of signals that are all pointing to a coordinated siege on the U.S. supply chain, and the intelligence suggests a breaking point is just weeks away, January 2026.
Okay, so to really understand this threat, we have to start with a core concept from the intelligence reports, the logic flicker. Now, this isn't some huge, obvious cyber attack. Think of it more like a subtle, silent software failure, a ghost in the machine that can corrupt tracking data, freeze up an inventory system, or just stop a delivery in its tracks, all with no clear explanation.
And that really brings us to the central question we're digging into today. You see, these logic flickers, they aren't happening in a vacuum. They're actually converging with some very real, very physical breaks in the supply chain.
So let's dive into our first threat vector. This is where we see how the digital backbone of our supply chain is failing. It's a kind of hybrid siege, where the main weapon is actually software.
The most obvious signal, the one you probably saw in the news, was that massive Amazon Web Services crash right on Christmas Eve, of all times. This wasn't just some small inconvenience. This was a direct hit. It paralyzed Amazon's own logistics, and it really exposed just how dangerously dependent our entire supply chain has become on just a handful of cloud providers.
And the problem just cascaded from there. It wasn't only Amazon. UPS customers were reporting that their tracking data was, and I'm quoting here, simply nuked. Target's warehouses had what they called a flash freeze, where software failures literally made their inventory untrackable. And at the same time, a huge carrier like J.B. Hunt is dealing with its own internal instability after getting rid of a third of its coding staff, which leaves them incredibly vulnerable.
And this slide right here gives us the ground truth from the Iron Knights, the truckers themselves. I mean, they're on the front lines of this thing, and they're calling these critical devices garbage because of all the constant glitches, the login failures, and tracking errors that are just wrecking their entire workflow.
Now, this intelligence summary starts naming names. It shows the specific vendors whose systems are having the most of these logic flickers. Geotab is flagged for more than 50 outages in just a few months. Samsara is reportedly plagued by connectivity issues, and Trimble is flagged as high risk because it's switching over to unproven AI agents, which, you gotta think, are prime targets for exploitation.
Okay, so let's pivot from the digital to the physical battle space, because here, a single kinetic event has dealt a massive blow to air cargo, and it's acting as a force multiplier for all those software problems we just talked about.
So back in early November 2025, a fatal UPS MD-11 crashed in Louisville. That triggered an emergency directive from the FAA. Inspections started revealing fatigue cracking, and they grounded the entire global fleet of these workhorse cargo planes. And they're probably going to stay on the ground until at least spring 2026.
109. That's 109 critical long-haul cargo aircraft. Grounded. Just gone from the global system, right at the peak of the holiday shipping season.
And for a giant like UPS, this one single event wiped out 9% of its entire fleet capacity. This is not a small disruption, folks. This is a systemic capacity kill that puts an immense amount of pressure on their entire remaining network, both the physical and the digital side.
The financial impact? Well, it was immediate and it was massive. FedEx reported a $17.5 million hit just in peak season extras. That's money they had to spend scrambling for other planes and making contingency plans to fill that void. And guess what? Those costs are now being passed down the chain.
All right, our third threat vector. This one's a regulatory crackdown that is creating a critical shortage of manpower, a purge, really, at the absolute worst possible time.
So just yesterday, on December 30th, the federal government suddenly decertified several major brands of those electronic logging devices. The directive was blunt. Drivers have to go back to using paper logs immediately, and their companies have until March 1st to replace all the hardware or be forced out of service.
And listen, this isn't just a small change. It is a forced regression. It's taking thousands of drivers out of this integrated real-time digital system and throwing them back to the 20th century with manual, error-prone paper logs. That creates a ton of operational friction.
And this is all happening at the exact same time as a massive regulatory purge of drivers with non-domiciled commercial licenses. So you're seeing 1,400 drivers being phased out in a state like Oregon, and a staggering number, nearly 200,000, are at risk nationally. We're talking about a potential capacity bloodbath for ground transport.
So here's the absolutely crucial point in all of this.
These three threat vectors, the digital failures, the physical grounding of the planes, and the regulatory purge of drivers, these are not isolated incidents. No, they are on a collision course.
Intelligence projects that all these forces are going to converge in mid-January 2026. The digital chaos meets the physical bottleneck and the regulatory squeeze, and that creates a perfect storm, a moment where the system's ability to move goods just breaks under the combined strain.
But what does this kind of large-scale systemic failure actually mean on a human level? For that, we're going to zoom in to one community that is actively preparing for the aftermath of this break. And here, we look at the concept of the oikos, which is a term used in the source material for the resilient household or the local community. We're focusing here on Merlin in Josephine County, Oregon, which is a community that's taking these threats very seriously. So instead of just hoping that the fragile digital grid holds up, they're reinforcing what the sources call analog relief centers. These are local, non-digital hubs. The existing food banks are already bracing for a drop in federal supplies, and you have faith-based groups stepping up to become backup distribution points, connecting local farms directly to the pantries.
And this, right here, is the key takeaway from how they're responding. True resilience, in the face of a complex, modern hybrid siege like this, it might not come from more technology. It might actually come from strengthening these local, less fragile, analog networks.
You know, there's this one single quote from the source material that just perfectly encapsulates this whole situation report. The grid is the battle space, the software is the siege, the oikos endures. The digital grid is the new battlefield, the failing software is the weapon, but the local community, the oikos, that's built to last.
And so that leaves us with one final, crucial question for you to consider as we watch these events unfold in January. How strong, how resilient are the supply lines that your own household, your own community, really depends on?